You're listening to Expertly Said, a podcast on the art and impact of communication. I'm Kristen Sweeney, founder and CEO of Every Little Word. My guest today is Kathryn Ahuja, physical therapist at Solstice Therapy. Kathryn is a physical therapist, yoga teacher, and pelvic floor rehab specialist. Her first career was in musical theater. Yay! And she paid the rent by teaching yoga. It was there that she first learned about the healing power of movement. Kathryn has worked in some of the busiest yoga studios across the country, leading super beginners through advanced yogis. She's also taught anatomy and hands-on adjustments to over 1,000 yoga teachers in training. After a decade of witnessing the healing power of exercise, Kathryn went back to school and graduated with a doctorate in physical therapy from New York Medical College, following in the footsteps of her parents, who are both PTs. She has specialized in the field of pelvic floor rehab since graduation, and in 2020 was recognized with the Pelvic Rehab Practitioner Certification Award for Excellence in this field. Kathryn, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here.
I'm really thrilled to have you here. So, full disclosure for our audience, Kathryn and I have a long shared history together. I have the privilege of knowing many of the guests on our show, but Kathryn and I have walked a number of career paths in the same place before we got to the points we are now. So really looking forward to this.
And have walked down the aisles of each other's weddings. So
that's true. Yes. I thought you were going to say walk down the large staircase at a Las Vegas show, which is also true.
Also true. Also true.
And I want to frame up for the audience this interview. I know lots of, this is a podcast about the art and impact of communication. And of course, for that reason, many of the guests we have on the show are in communications, in content, in marketing. And it's a privilege to be able to interview those folks. But when I conceived the original idea for this show, I wanted it to be even broader than that. I wanted to create a show that allowed the exploration of communication, not just that intersected directly with the kind of work we do at Every Little Word, but really explored communication on a lot of different levels, because all of us need communication in our professional lives, our personal lives as well, of course. And so because I know a little bit about Kathryn's background and I have some ideas about communication and what that means, in these fields where words are sort of intersecting with movement, I really wanted to have her on the show, and I'm super excited for her to be here. So Kathryn, you shared a little bit of your background in that bio, but tell us more about that professional journey and the kind of phases of your career.
Yeah. So I was a little girl who had a big dream. It was Broadway, it was movies, it was, lights, camera, action, all of it. And when I think back to sort of what drove me into performing arts, it was actually with an intention to help people. I certainly found that, from childhood through adulthood now, there is something really noble. There is something really powerful about stories and the way that stories can heal us, can make us feel less alone, can make us feel something different if we're feeling something negative, right? They can uplift. They can remind us what being human is all about. And so I kind of went into the field of performing arts with this idea of I'm going to tell the great stories and I'm going to make great art and I'm going to help people to feel things. And unfortunately for me and my career, it didn't always go in that direction. Through many different circumstances, for many different reasons, my musical theater career just wasn't going in the way that I wanted it to. And I was kind of stuck in this place of, well, I have to choose either dancing on a Disney cruise, which doesn't feel like doing a lot of help for people maybe, or maybe there's some other way that I can use this intention of healing. And so that's when I was kind of looking at going back to school. Now, throughout my performing arts career, I was kind of, as you said in the intro, paying the rent by teaching yoga. And it was something that came easily to me. I think as a dancer, I had a decent understanding about my body, at least. I could somehow, I guess, kind of naturally communicate to others how to move their body. And as I honed that craft a little bit more and got to practice that teaching a little bit more, I got to see that I was actually doing the thing I was setting out to do in performing by being a yoga teacher. This idea of helping people, bringing healing, alleviating some of the burden of life, I was doing already in the yoga studio. And so at that moment, it kind of became easy to shift away from that musical theater career that was not serving me, and shift towards something else that could serve me and the world a little bit better. So that's when I decided to go back to school. Both of my parents are physical therapists. So I grew up in a house kind of knowing what it was like to have a career that you could make a decent living while doing good for other people and putting
Mhm.
good into the world. So I was very familiar with that. Uh, and when I went back to school, I found that I got to kind of get the science and the nerdy piece that sort of filled in what I already intuitively felt about yoga. I now had facts and figures and reasons why exercise was helping people. And that was just really exciting to me. Um, in terms of my specialty, I am a pelvic floor rehab specialist. That is 99% of the cases that I see these days. And I really got into that straight away from graduation. Unfortunately, in PT school, we got 1 day for all things women's health. 1 day.
Oh.
That was supposed to be, pregnancy through menopause and beyond. And got this teeny tiny introduction that told me, oh, here's something that is clearly very underserved. And I could sort of see where my natural soft skills and ability could match up with a very niche part of the PT world. Because I, like everybody else, thought I was going to graduate and work with dancers and athletes. Like, that's the dream.
Mm.
Uh, but I found, okay, that's not actually that specialized. That's what everybody wants to do. So while I was still in school, I did my entry level work to getting into pelvic floor rehab, and that was a much more extensive course load. And I said, okay, this is the place for me. And I fell in love with it and have never turned back.
That's awesome. I love that. There's so many things coming out of that. I love how you've shared kind of this thread of like healing and, looking back on your musical theater ambitions and seeing how that was running through it. So I do want to share, you and I intersected first in that career, right? We were
Yeah.
both part of the stage production Jubilee, which was one of the original kind of like old school Bob Mackie costume shows on the Vegas Strip. So we spent 6 months out there, trained at the
It
same
was
yoga studios.
everything that Taylor Swift wants to be now.
So-
Quite literally.
I actually had some friends text me when the Pamela Anderson Life of a Showgirl.
Uh-huh.
It's basically, I think they pull a lot of costumes and stuff from Jubilee. So I haven't seen it, but I definitely want to. And just kind of, the show's not there anymore. The hotel I don't think is even there anymore, and just sort of reminisce about it. Because it was a very specific moment in time. And then
Yes.
we intersected, of course, in teaching yoga for many years, and similar to you, I call yoga like one of my 1,000 day jobs. I've had,
Yes.
uh, caterer, personal assistant, like, all sorts of things. And for me, I remember thinking, okay, New York is really hard for auditioning, and it's a grind, and it's, most days are not satisfying. And if I'm going to make it here, emotionally, I need something that can give me that sort of feeling of like satisfaction of having done well or done something that matters to me on a more regular basis than waiting to get cast in the next production. And so for me, teaching yoga became that thing, where I too felt it was really gratifying, and I felt a lot of translation of the kind of presence, you are up kind of in front of a crowd and things like that, of being able to translate that over, as well as, of course, getting more connected with my body. Um, and one of the interesting things about the style, I guess, that we both trained in was that I think, unlike a lot of yoga, what a lot of yoga teachers do, very specifically, we were both taught to teach only with our words. So demonstration could or could not be part of the program. Very often the room was so crowded, you didn't have room to demonstrate. Um, And so that's one of the things I think about earliest is like this idea of, using the verbal to communicate and move a body. And I imagine that, spills right over into what you're often doing in PT as well. So can you talk about that idea a little bit and maybe how that may have shifted for you over the years?
For sure. I think, there's a huge difference between getting one individual person to move and getting an entire room of people to move. And there's another layer of that is getting someone who you know extremely well, have done some sort of an examination or some tests and measures on, asking them to move in some kind of a way, and asking a stranger to move. And then there's a whole nother layer when you're asking somebody who is in pain or is injured, or has fear around a particular movement to do something that brings up pain, fear, or difficulty
Hmm.
versus a healthy norm. Right. So there's definitely been several different layers that I've had to learn of how to educate folks in terms of how to move their body, and and different ways that I've had to adjust my communication for that. If
Yeah.
we start with sort of the yoga career and how to get a room full of strangers to move, it's actually a pretty daunting task, right? Because they're walking in off the street. Yes, we'd get plenty of repeat students, but we'd also have, I taught mostly mixed level classes. So you'd have an absolute beginner who had never done yoga before, who was maybe there because his girlfriend dragged him there, in a room with someone who's been practicing for many years, is, chanting and meditating before class and could probably teach me quite a lot. And they're all in the room and they're all looking at me. So you have to become very good at finding the specific words and the specific cues that create an action, and trying to talk to that greatest common denominator in that space. Understanding that some folks who are maybe lower than that common denominator or more beginner than that may get a little lost at some point.
Hmm.
Understanding that it may sound a little too pedantic to those more advanced practitioners, but we really have to find, okay, what's our middle ground here, and what's the easiest and most effective way to get someone to move from A to B. I have found that in some ways that task is a little bit easier when you know a little bit less. As you layer on anatomy and physiology and all these layers of education, we can sometimes start to use language. We can forget what that more common folk are speaking about or thinking about in terms of their body. That most people in the room have no idea where their hip flexors are. Truly.
The curse of knowledge, the curse of
Yes.
knowledge. Yeah.
That most people have no idea what spinal extension is, And so if I'm using terms that are very anatomical, that are very professional, if you will, I'm missing most of the people in the room. So the little formula that we kind of that I kind of figured out and worked with some of my teachers on, is the idea of a body part and an action. So we have a subject and a verb. Yeah.
Love it.
And that body part needs to be it needs to be the toddler's version of the body part. Your right arm goes up.
Mhm.
Lengthen the top of your head towards the ceiling. Yeah. So we have that action, we have that body part, and we have some direction that body part is going towards.
Mhm.
Uh, that kind of, I think, took me really far in terms of creating a classroom feeling and getting a lot of people to do the same thing at the same time. When we now take that to a private yoga client, that's when we can
Mhm.
become a little bit more specific, where I can, with time, create a repertoire, even a language of, okay, this person knows the yoga postures, right? They know what the names of these poses are. So
Right.
I can say, start with warrior one on your right side, and they can begin. There's a
Hmm.
common knowledge, and now we've sort of raised what that middle denominator thing is.
Right.
That goes to another layer when I'm working in my physical therapy practice and I'm teaching an exercise. I do have the ability to demonstrate for them. I do have the ability to put my hands on them and cue and say, look, I see you using this part of your body, but I want you to use this part of your body. I can become much more specific the fewer people are in the room, and the better that I get to know them.
Yeah. And I love this. And I think there are, just for kind of listeners, a lot of pretty obvious, like broad communications applications for what we're talking about here, right?
Sure.
And I don't want to belabor by being like, well, if you're doing this, but something I think is interesting is when you talk about that lowest common denominator, like that's something that I think often in marketing, let's say, we're very focused on segmentation, right? And like being almost, how can we create that feeling of one-to-one, right? That's what we're talking about when it's personalization. So how can we get someone in a private session who's a repeat client? Or how can we divide up the class in such a way that everyone here in this email sequence, is at this level of knowledge? But what you're talking about, and I think it's important, is that more educational setting where by nature the group is diverse. And there are many opportunities, whether that's even thinking about like an employee base, right? That different levels of knowledge about different areas, different levels of skill, where you are going to need to be able to speak in the plainest language possible, knowing it's not going to hit 100% for everybody, and still being okay with that. And that sometimes that is the most effective thing that you can do. I love what you said too about not making it overly technical sometimes. It's something that we do a lot in our work is we work with those folks who are super technical, and then we kind of decide, like, when we're creating content, depending on who it's for, how much of this do we need to keep? How much of this do we need to explain first? How much of this do we need to really strip back and state in different kinds of language? And all of those choices end up determining how well that message, hopefully lands and resonates. So I love that. And the idea, of course, that the more you know somebody, so whether if you're in a one-to-one interaction with someone, you can make it extremely personal and extremely tailored communication. But the more people you're talking to, the more kind of choices you have to make in that regard. What about, you know, let's say when you're working in PT, we think about communication so much as, for us, we do a lot of written communication. Video communication is very popular, but still most of this is based on words, right? In a business context, it's still very much language based. I imagine you are communicating, or your clients are communicating with you on some other levels as well. So can you talk about that a little bit and what kind of signals you're maybe looking for from them?
For sure. Um, I, I will start with, though, there are a lot of words that I am using and that my patients are using. And I do pride myself in being incredibly specific about the words and the language that I do use and the words and the language that I don't use, because I think it makes a tremendous effect on the therapeutic alliance. Particularly in the specialty that I'm in, I work in pelvic health, and for anyone who's not familiar with pelvic floor rehab, that can include an examination, an internal examination, either vaginally or rectally, or sometimes both. So most of the people who are walking in my door are coming in. They have a symptom, they have pain potentially, they have discomfort, they have embarrassment around their symptoms, and they're also incredibly nervous about what I'm about to do. And so I am extremely intentional about my communication, particularly on that first interaction,
Yeah.
both verbal and nonverbal. Um, One of the first things that I say when I start an examination, that initial interaction with a patient, is that I tell them, what's going to happen. I tell them the agenda so that they have a chance to sit back and relax. And I say, we're going to start with your story, and we have plenty of time. Please take me back as far as you think we need to go. Tell me whatever it is that you think is important. And your words matter to me, and the way you tell me your story matters to me. So I just want you to start with that place. So many people, I think all of us, have had an experience in healthcare where we felt not listened to.
Yeah.
Right? That's so common. And so many of my patients start with, I have been seeking a diagnosis for 10 years. No one seems to understand what my
Gosh.
symptoms are. Doctors are brushing me off. They give me a medication and it doesn't work, and they don't know why it doesn't work. And you're my last resort. And if this doesn't work, I don't know what I'm going to do. Yeah. But so many of us have just had that experience where, look, a lot of medical professionals are rushed. We don't have enough time to see people adequately, unfortunately. How many of us have had an experience where a doctor never even looked up from their computer during the course of their exam? I have,
Yeah.
you know? And so taking that time to let people know, look, we have the time and I want to hear you. Because most of the time, if you actually sit and listen, your patients will tell you what the problem is. And they will tell you what the solution is if you really give them the space and the time to unwind it. So that's kind of the words. There are a few questions as well that I always ask my patients at the end of that initial examination. And I tell them, I ask everybody this. One of them is, look, you've seen plenty of doctors, you've done your Googling, you've read whatever, you've been on TikTok. What do you, right? Because that's where a lot of us are getting our medical
Yep.
information these days.
Yep.
And I say, okay, what do you think is going on? And a lot of times they'll kind of pause and say, well, I don't know. That's why I'm here. And I'll say, no, no, no. If you could just explain it to me, how it feels inside of your body, what does it feel like? What do you think? And most of the time, they're 75 to 95% accurate on what's going on.
Wow. Wow.
And and maybe they're not able to, give a medical diagnosis, but they're able in that time to reveal something that they don't reveal just talking about the history and saying, my pain is a 6 when I wake up in the morning and it's a 9 when I go to bed at night. There's a deeper level that comes up with
Mm-hmm.
that. Another thing that I ask all of my patients is, deep down, what is the fear for you if this doesn't get better? Because when you start to talk about people's fears, again, we unwrap another layer about what they believe about their symptoms, what they believe about their diagnosis, what they believe about their body, and what they believe about the effect that I could actually have for them. And then one of the last things that I always say, again, because of the work that I do, is, do you have any experience with sexual abuse or trauma that I may need to know about?
Mm-hmm.
And even if the answer is no, I usually proceed forward as if the answer is yes, because it's just so common and just so hard to even
Wow.
talk about.
Yeah.
In terms of those nonverbal communications, uh, I start evaluating my clients when they stand up from the waiting room chair. And not to make anybody feel self-conscious or something at their next
Right.
next PT exam, right? And part of that is, look, I want to see, are you getting up using the hand rests? Are you getting up quickly? Is there a wince? Is there a change in your breath when you stand up? I'm looking at your gait, obviously. That's a physical thing as well. I'm always watching how you sit while we're talking, because a lot of times the postures that folks choose have a diagnosis that they're kind of correlated to. I say I can often diagnose you by the way that you're sitting in your chair.
Wow. That's fascinating.
Uh, and and then I think, the questions that I've laid out there too, and sort of the physical responses to those questions matter to me as well, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's all before I put my hands on somebody.
Yeah.
When I do get to a place in an examination where I'm putting my hands on somebody, there is we start to introduce that nonverbal communication as I'm physically interacting with their bodies, but I'm also very specific that my verbal communication continues and maybe even accelerates. That before I touch anywhere on their body, I'm going to ask for permission, whether it's their
Uh-huh.
shoulders or their genitals. Uh, that I'm going to tell them what's going to happen before it happens, because that changes how somebody's body reacts as well.
Yeah.
If I'm going to touch a painful place on you, I want to give you some warning there, uh, versus just going straight to touching that area.
Hmm.
Um, yeah,
How about during maybe exercises or anything like that? Is there, and this kind of gets into my next question, which
sure.
is around the idea of, I know, and again, parallels, like
Yeah, yeah.
there's a lot of measures and scales and um, ways to kind of quantify experience or mobility or
Mm,
pain level and things like that. But then I also can't help but think, I've been in PT. I'm a huge advocate for it. I'm in PT right now for a toddler induced injury. And, every time they ask me my pain level, I just am a little like, and then I give an answer. And I just think, gosh, I consider myself relatively in tune with my body. And this kind of feels like a dart. And
mm,
so I'm curious how you maybe use what you're able to observe. It's the qualitative and the quantitative, right? When the quantitative, where are you on a scale of 1 to 10, also has quite a lot of subjectivity baked in. So can you just talk about those pieces a little bit?
sure. Well, first of all, the pain scale 1 to 10, I never ask folks. It means almost nothing. It it can mean something. Every once in a while, it means something when you get the person who, on the pain scale 1 to 10, they circle 11, or they cross it out and write 15. That's a whole nother route and a whole nother way that I'm starting to think about what might be going on in that person. But those exceptions aside, it means almost nothing. And particularly if we're monitoring someone's pain within a session or in response to an exercise, it means just about nothing. And in
Uh,
fact, the 0 to 10 pain scale was created by drug companies to help us know when we're supposed to offer opioids. So the pain scale is worthless for me, mostly. In terms of how people are responding within a session, or how, if they're then not telling me about pain, if we're not discussing pain, what am I looking for? I'm always looking for someone's breathing. Always looking for somebody's breathing. And maybe that goes back to the yoga training. But so if someone starts holding their breath, if somebody starts getting red in the face in order to do an exercise, uh, there's no way that exercise is appropriate for them. That's
uh,
always an indication for me to stop, pull back, uh, ask some more questions that are more interesting than what their pain is, or shift what's going on there. The moment we stop breathing, our physiology is changing. We're holding in something that needs to be released, and we're not getting in something that we need to take in. More specifically for the field that I work in, there's a tremendous amount of connection between our breath and our pelvic floor. So that's also just a place that I'm always interested in. But with any exercise, I don't care if we're doing weighted deadlifts or if we're doing, uh, marching on your back on the table. I am looking at how you're breathing, how you're coordinating that breathing, and that will indicate to me so much about what we need to do and where we need to go.
hmm. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I'm just thinking about the idea of, you know, I can imagine for a lot of people being pulled back from that is surprising to them because of how they think about what it means to kind of work hard or
Yeah.
recover.
Yeah.
Um, I think that's a nice segue for us to head into our one big idea. And I'm super excited about this. So, this is a chance for us to get into the nitty gritty details of one insight, experience, or aspect of your work that's had a meaningful impact for you. And you want to talk about a concept that was brand new to me and is probably brand new. So, I'm going to start by just asking you to explain it, which is Nocebic language.
Yeah.
Go.
Great. I think so much of what we've already talked about is kind of setting the stage for this. So great interview skills,
Thank you.
and just natural progression there. So, Nocebic language or nocebo language, most people are familiar with the concept of the placebo. So, you've been given a sugar pill, you're told that it's going to cure some symptom. You take the sugar pill, and miraculously, you feel better, even though there was no medicine that was actually given. The placebo effect is a very real effect. It's not just miracles and magic. There is actual science behind that. There are actual biochemical changes that occur when someone is given a placebo. So it's not just smoke and mirrors, if you will. That's placebo, right? So nocebo is going to be the opposite of that, where a negative belief, a negative intention is going to cause increased pain or physical harm. So examples that are almost so common, we don't even realize how this is nocebo communication. The first are you in medical settings using overly scary or fear-mongering terms, things like your knee joint is bone on bone, your disc is herniated, your cervix is incompetent. Really big, scary words for somebody who doesn't have medical knowledge. Pain monitoring, as we've just alluded to, also has a nocebo effect. If I come in and ask you, what's your pain on a scale of 1 to 10, I am implicitly telling you that you should be experiencing pain during this scenario. And so, what does that mean if your pain is 0? What does that mean if your pain is 11? Pain monitoring in and of itself can actually have negative effects, can actually increase how much pain a patient feels. And then
That's
another one in there is a mortality diagnosis. So being told this is fatal, you have 3 to 6 months to live. That can affect someone's mortality just being given a timeline.
wow. Yeah. I mean, I recoil at that, like on just a very visceral level. Hearing something like that is then, I know obviously thousands of people probably hear that kind of um, statement from a physician every day, but it does feel like, how do you pick yourself up and go on from there?
Yeah.
Um, it's it's interesting you say that. So one of the first things that came to mind, I was, I think, 34 or 35 when I was pregnant with I think 34 when I was pregnant, and then 35 when I delivered my first daughter. And I was fortunate enough, God bless the Mount Auburn midwives up in Cambridge. They were amazing. But I remember having friends around the same age, and I kept hearing this term geriatric pregnancy. And I
Hmm.
was like, sorry, isn't geriatric a term for like when your bones are breaking and you're using a cane? I mean, like it's just
Yes.
something completely different. And I remember asking my midwife, and she was like, here's the science. This isn't valid. It's an outdated term. We'll never speak of it again. And I was like,
Amazing.
all right, I'm on board. But I
Amazing.
think about how I had a lot of other challenges during my pregnancies, and how if I had had to layer on these other pieces that I knew friends and family were dealing with, how much more difficult that process would have been. And I felt like I'd really been gifted just you can just let that go. I'm your medical professional telling you, just put it out of your mind, instead of being this person in authority telling you, well, you've got this label of geriatric pregnancy. And it's like, and
Hmm.
what does that mean? And what is, um, so you talked about this. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of like do no harm
Yeah,
underpinning of this, and why you feel like it's so important?
sure. So, why I'm kind of getting on a soapbox about this, or why does this actually matter? Why is this the big idea that I want to bring forward? Is because in the field of medicine, and I'll go ahead and throw in fitness instructors and maybe the whole health and wellness community, we are supposed to be beginning with this dictum of do no harm. I think at the very least amount of striving, we're supposed to not make people worse, right? But it, just these very common phrases that I've thrown out there that every one of us has probably heard, we are unintentionally creating harm before we put our hands on somebody. And I do believe it's important to state that nocebo language is almost always really well intended, actually. We are trying to be real with our patients. We're trying to give them the truth. We're trying to give them all of our education. We're trying to give them a good understanding of the procedure that they're about to undergo, of the risks that they're going to take. Yeah. But time and time again, the research shows us that these words can actually be really detrimental to our outcomes. And specifically, if we kind of go into some of the science behind that, because it is just kind of ideas and words, I think we can all kind of understand, like, oh yeah, I guess hearing the word pain maybe could make things feel more painful, or like hearing geriatric pregnancy, that makes me feel sad. Okay, right? But we actually have some real good evidence behind this and real science behind this. So, for example, nocebo language, when we hear those nocebo words, there are certain neurotransmitters that are released from our brain, and they can antagonize the natural opioid receptors inside of our brains. So we all produce natural opioids, and those are the things that fight pain, if you will, the same way that opioid medication does. So if we have these neurotransmitters coming out and blocking or antagonizing those opioid receptors, we will increase pain. We will experience increased pain. Another study looked at taking functional MRIs, so real-time MRIs, and looking at what parts of the brain light up when a patient is being told a procedure is going to be painful versus not being told to expect pain. And the areas of the hippocampus and the cingulate cortex light up when we anticipate pain.
Wow.
What are those areas? Control learning and memory, and the reward center. They light up when we're being told you might experience pain here, and they stay totally quiet when we don't talk about the pain. So this is real. This is not just fluffy language.
Yeah.
This isn't just ideas. This is actual science. And if we want to be doing good medicine, we need to be using good words.
It's such a heavy responsibility, honestly. I think in addition to, um, everything else let's say you're trying to do in a 1 hour session with a patient. I know there's a ton of administrative work that goes along with it, working on the patient. Um, where do you think, you mentioned this is well intended. Where do you think it comes from that this is almost the default? And I will say, I think we see this in marketing, we see this in business, like capture your customers, capture demand. Like in business, there's a lot of like very aggressive war undertone, zero sum kind of language. And it's very easy to just use it. It's what you hear, it's what everybody else is doing, and to use it without really examining it and thinking deeply about it. And partly that work is hard, and there's not always a clear, easy answer for what you do instead. So I'm curious what's maybe worked for you, or, how if you're advising other PTs, or if you're all together, like how you're thinking about shifting this after you've recognized it.
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. I think similar to what you're speaking about in business, the medical world is very hierarchical,
Hmm. I think so.
right? And there's a lot of stuff that gets passed down and passed down and passed down. It's very mentorship oriented. So we all default to what our mentors have told us. And these words and phrases and languaging is so passed down and so ingrained in us that we don't even realize how harmful it actually is. Everybody is saying it. Everyone's using these terms. Everyone's email blasts say these things. So I should be using these things too. So I think it comes from potentially just a lack of self-awareness, a lack of asking, could I potentially do better? And a lack of wanting to rock the boat or change the norms. As a pelvic PT, though, I sort of operate in the realm of breaking the norms and asking the questions because our field is still so so niche. Our field is still so under-recognized. Our field is still so under-researched. So I think innately we tend to be folks who are willing to be a little bit more self-reflective, who've had to ask our own selves, what can I do to be better? Because we don't have a long lineage of answers because our field is still kind of new.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I imagine too some of the just biases that we see in medicine generally are, end up making their way in, especially when it comes to women's health.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And look, everybody has bias. I have a ton of bias. Um, and so do our patients. And so that's where some of those questions like asking, what do you think is going on? It starts to get to folks' biases. It starts to get to their belief system.
Mm,
It starts to get to what are their, not just their symptoms, but their attitudes about their symptoms, because all of that is going to affect how I end up treating them.
yeah.
And I think acknowledging my own biases too, and acknowledging the areas that I uh, have incompetent education as well. But if I can sit with a person, listen to that person, and respond to them like I might want someone to speak to me,
Yeah.
I think I end up doing better than a lot of folks out there,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah. I in thinking about this language piece, it's something that there's definitely a movement, I'll say in marketing that I've seen where um it's kind of like anti some of the predatory practices.
Okay.
So anti some things like countdown timers or urgent windows that don't really exist or some specific language. And so it's interesting where, some of that's based on these principles of how to influence people to buy. And certainly in a business context, do no harm is not really the underlying foundation, right?
Sure.
Well, probably varies for people, but at the end of the day, a business needs to sell stuff. I mean, that is, you know,
Yep.
why it exists. So it's just interesting to think about that and again, like how you make those choices and also I think in some ways to be on a path and know that you're not doing it perfectly. But you're still trying to consider. And even among our team, like we'll have times where we're editing each other's work or things, and one of us will just flag something and be like, that's not really, and it's, oh my gosh, something you've said for so long. And you look and you're like, yeah. And you know what? Like you could argue and say, well, I'm just going to say it this way. But it's like, why? Like, what are we really
Yeah.
losing changing these three words that were probably a cliche anyway?
Yeah, for
Um,
sure. For sure. Right. And there are so many tropes and shortcut ways of saying things that are in my brain. And and look, sometimes they are the right thing. You know, if a patient comes in and describes to me their their knee joint is bone on bone, I might actually use their words.
mhm.
I might talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, so I there's definitely some attenuation to the particular client in front of me at that time. I think also about you listening to how people describe their symptoms. I will have people who tell me, no, it's not pain, it's burning. It's not pain, it's pressure. And I want to be very specific that I'm always like, okay, Kristen, I got to talk about her pressure, not about her pain, right?
Right.
Because that makes you feel like I've listened to you.
Mhm.
Even if the symptom you're coming in with, everyone says, okay, that's a pain condition. No, but for Kristen, it's pressure. So yes,
Yeah.
it is a learning curve. It is catching myself again and saying, oh no, I could do better. There's a better way to describe that. There's a better way. I think I'm just hoping to stay open to the idea of doing my little bit to be a little bit better
Yeah.
each
Yeah.
day. Because if we try to change everything all at once, and I have an amazing mentor who, whenever I speak with him or hear from him, I want to change everything that I do overnight.
Yeah.
And I walk away being like, who am I? Like, I'm feeling that imposter syndrome, feeling like a sham. How could I even call myself a decent therapist after being in his presence? And he's actually incredibly specific about, look, tomorrow change one thing with one patient. One thing
Yeah.
with one patient. Don't change your whole session. Because if you're in the position that you're in right now, you're already doing a good job.
Hmm.
And I think some of that striving mentality comes from imposter syndrome, comes from wanting to be our most fully developed versions of ourselves now.
Hmm.
And the truth is, none of us ever gets there without taking one slow step at a time. And that's where change actually sticks, you
Yeah,
know?
I love that. I love that. We had a guest on recently, Kristen, and who talked about um like small doable iteration as the path forward to improvement. And I think that really aligns. Yeah.
And I
Awesome.
teach that to my clients too, right? If I'm asking you to go home, I'm never going to send you home with 10 exercises on the first day and 3 lifestyle modifications because you will do none of them. You will feel
Hmm.
overwhelmed, you will do none of them, and you probably won't come back, right? So
Yeah.
I will often say, okay, we learned 4 things. Pick the one thing that you're going to do this week.
Hmm.
And they're like, "Whoa, but I'm so desperate for change. I want to do all of them." No, no, no. Pick one. And if you're
Yeah.
great at that, we'll add a second one in because that's how we make lasting change.
Go slow to go fast. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
To go
for
far.
sure. Yeah, love that. All right. So this has been fantastic. I want to wrap us up because we're
Sure.
getting close to time with
Sure,
our
sure.
recurring segment. I ask everybody the same 5 questions. So just go with your gut on these answers. Are you
Sure.
ready?
As ready as I can be.
Question 1. What's your favorite word to say out loud?
So I think words that have "shus" in the ending, precious, delicious,
Oh,
precocious. I like the "shus" at the end.
shush, shush.
Yeah.
That reminds me of that, like Ryan Gosling. I'm not sure if it's a Canadian thing or just a Ryan Gosling where they give a little bit of that like super slushy
Okay.
S, like shush. Like it's a
Yeah.
little, I don't know, something about it. Okay. Question 2. What's a word you know from reading, but you're a little bit hesitant to say it out loud because you're not quite sure how to pronounce it?
So this was a hard one for me to identify. I'm sure there is that word out there, but what came to mind when you asked this question is I am from Jersey, and there are some words that I have to consciously choose to say a different way that I was taught to say one way, and I've consciously
Okay.
chosen to say a different way. And I think that the biggest one is the word aunt. I was raised to say aunt, and every time before that word comes out of my mouth, I feel like an imposter. Like I have to correct myself to aunt. I've made that choice as an adult.
I say aunt.
There you go.
A good old Midwestern parents. It's your aunt.
There you go.
Nice. All right. Question 3. What's one phrase or saying you wish could be retired for good?
Ah, does that make sense?
Oh, tell me more. I use this one often.
It it is one that I use too, and I'm trying to be aware of it and take it out of my own uh, daily use. I find that this phrase is a way of seeking approval. It
Mm.
is I find that women use it a lot more than men. And I find that it's a way of sort of backing away from taking a definitive stance on something or making a declarative statement. We throw it in at the end of something that could be really powerful or really informative or really strong. And we throw in, does that make sense? Because we're seeking the affirmation from the other person because we're not
Interesting.
willing to stand in the period at the end of the sentence. And it drives me crazy when I hear it.
I'm gonna think about that. I
Okay.
really am. I find often I'll use it with my team, and it's usually if I think I've explained something that was I'm downloading my brain, and I'm like not
Yeah.
sure if I've elaborated in a way that is logical.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna reflect on that. I like it.
Cool.
What's a communication hill you're willing to die on?
Communication hill I'm willing to die on. This is another one that I thought about for a while. And I don't know. I came up with a lot of different ideas, but I think the most important one is particularly if I'm speaking to my fellow medical professionals, but really maybe anybody, is listen more and educate less. when we sit back and we listen more, we will get the whole story, and we will get the story underneath the story. Particularly our patients don't need an anatomy lesson. They don't need more information. They need the time to have somebody hear their full entire story, because that can have tremendous placebo effects.
Yeah, I love that. As an aside, I really love your positive framing of placebo. I don't think it's always got that connotation with it. I think that's maybe changing, but I think sometimes
Placebo's
it's this feeling of
phenomenal.
being hoodwinked or,
No.
like, and yeah, I too understand it as something very real and like to be used positively,
Yeah.
if possible. Also, per this conversation and talking about language, communication hill you're willing to die on. So there it is. It just shows up, right? Like right in
Yeah.
when you least expect it. All right,
All of it.
last one. What's the last thing you read, heard, or watched that's really stuck with you?
So I'm a big fiction fan, and one of my favorite authors is Leonel Shriver, and her book, just read her book, The Motion of the Body Through Space. And it's a fictional work about a couple who is aging and their relationship to fitness. The wife has been a lifelong exerciser. The husband retires and is going to compete in a triathlon. And their belief systems around what fitness is actually supposed to be about, what exercise is for all of us. I think one of the most interesting conversations they have is around, okay, if we had a science discovery where you could plug your body in overnight and have, the perfect physical fitness, would you still exercise?
Interesting.
Right? Right?
Yeah.
What do we get out of this?
Yeah.
So she's always got
I think a
a
lot about that in context of sometimes like wanting things that are separate from, I just say like trying to be a better person, just like
yeah.
for me, that's watching TV, like watching TV objectively,
Yeah.
watching a TV show does not make me a better person. And
No.
that's part of why I love it,
Right.
because all these other things I do, even things I enjoy, can kind of be tied back in some way, made to feel like work in a
Mhm.
way. So that's really fascinating.
Yeah. Highly recommend.
Interesting. All right. Excellent. Going on my list. Kathryn, thank you so much for joining us
Yeah.
today. If our listeners want to learn more about you, where can they find you?
Best place to get at me is Instagram. I'm having a difficult relationship with social media right now, but every once in a while I check in on my Instagram. So it's at Kathryn Ahuja _DPT.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here today. I loved this conversation, and I know
Me
our
too.
listeners will too.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Expertly Said. We're produced by Every Little Word, a boutique content and communications agency. If you liked what you heard, you know what to do. Subscribe, share the episode with a colleague, or leave us a review. If you want to connect with me directly, please do. You can find me on LinkedIn. Just search Kristen Sweeney. Thanks for listening. Talk soon.